Lingua Franca core actually seriously impacted on what I was focusing on in classrooms. They need to know the pronunciation of those words before they read. Otherwise, they can't successfully, with reasonable ease, they can't read.
Welcome to the PronSIG podcast. The IATEFL Pronunciation Special Interest Group, PronSIG, has been at the forefront of pronunciation teaching, both in theory and in practice, since 1986. In this podcast, we interview key figures in PronSIG history and the wider pronunciation field to provide our listeners with the chance to get to know them and their careers a little more personally in this conversation-style format. In this episode, I talk to Robin Walker. But before we get started, here is some information about how you can see us in April 2026 at the annual IATEFL conference in Brighton. We'd love you to come and join us for our PronSIG pre-conference event day on the 20th, which will be on the topic of lifelong voices, teaching pronunciation from childhood to seniorhood. Or you can see us at one of our Showcase Day talks or workshops on the 21st, and or at our 40th anniversary celebration party on the evening of Wednesday the 22nd of April. Today's guest, Robin Walker, has been involved in English language teaching since 1981, working as a teacher, teacher educator, materials writer and consultant. He has regularly collaborated with Oxford University Press and Trinity College London, as well as with regional educational authorities in Spain where he lives. He's published numerous articles on pronunciation and is the author of a handbook for teachers, teaching the pronunciation of English as a lingua franca in 2010, and more recently teaching English pronunciation for a global world alongside his co-author and outgoing PronSIG coordinator Gemma Archer in 2025. He was editor of the PronSIG journal Speak Out from 2008 to 2015. But without further ado, let's get on with the interview. Hi everybody, welcome to the podcast for today. So here I am with Robin Walker. I'm very, very excited to have him as a guest on the podcast. My personal connection to Robin begins with IATEFL in 2024 in Brighton when I saw him present with Gemma Archer, presenting the book, which I actually have a copy of right here. Teaching English pronunciation for a global world. And Robin was up there presenting and he said something to me that I hadn't heard anybody say before. He said, pronunciation is in all four skills. It's in speaking, of course, listening, of course, but reading and writing. And I thought, yes, absolutely. Why is that not common knowledge? And so that sent me down the path of having a look at what Robin's authored and the things that he's done. So as I said, I'm very, very excited to have him on the podcast today. So welcome, Robin.
Thank you for organizing this. Yeah.
You're very welcome. Okay, so Robin, I'm going to start off the podcast today with a sort of terminology speed round. So just thinking about listeners who might not be so familiar with some of the terminology that might come up in the podcast. We can start with English as a lingua franca.
Yeah, English as a lingua franca. It's interesting. We actually didn't call it that at the beginning. We called it English as an international language. And it was decided that lingua franca was a better term. And they're very similar. They're not exactly identical, but lingua franca is a nice term because it suggests that it's out there and that it belongs to everybody. Whereas English as an international language is a bit like McDonald's, that there's one place in the world that has the recipe and it's sort of hired out to you and you have to do it the way the recipe says. You're not allowed to make any variations. And lingua franca suggests we can all make the variations that we feel are appropriate to the place where we are working or living. And so English as a lingua franca is English being used predominantly by people for whom it's not their first language. And it's being used in order to facilitate international communication. It's interesting because the minute you talk about English as a lingua franca, then the native speakers don't have any particularly special role. They don't own it. It's owned by everybody who's using the language. And once you are the owner of a language, of course, then you're as free as anybody else to modify the language to make it work for you. And that's what's so exciting about English as a lingua franca.
Mm-hmm.
That the
Yeah.
users are
So I guess,
predominantly non-native speakers, and they are modifying it. And of course, what interested me and interests other people is that most of the most tangible modifications are in the pronunciation of the language.
okay, and I guess we're also talking about sort of people who would have learned English as a foreign language communicating with other people who have learned it as a foreign language as well, absent of so-called native speakers.
Yeah. And of course,
Yeah.
the great thing about calling it English as a lingua franca is you get rid of the word foreign, and you
Mm-hmm.
stop calling people foreigners,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Good point.
which of course is hierarchical. You
Mm-hmm.
have
Okay.
somebody from Saudi Arabia talking to somebody from Brazil. It's actually stupid to talk about English as a foreign language. Neither of them are foreign.
Absolutely. Yeah. 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 Okay. So what about the lingua franca core? What's that, and why is that important for us?
Well, it's the result of the work of Jennifer Jenkins, and it was using field data. So it's not lab data, it's actual real data, empirical data. What she was interested in was she wanted to know which bits of pronunciation seemed critical in order for people to be intelligible to each other when they were using English as a lingua franca. All of the work about, what really matters in pronunciation had been done looking at a native speaker listener. And so it's biased towards what native speakers do. But of course, we're looking at this lingua franca world, and what she wanted to know was what was critical, which were the priorities for easy intelligibility between non-native speakers. And the lingua
Yeah. Yeah.
franca core is what came out of her research.
Okay. I'm sure that will definitely come up again a little bit later on. Are there any other terms or things that you think are important to get out there when before at this stage?
I loved coming to Tracy Derwing and Murray Monroe. I loved a bit of research that they did on accent and intelligibility. And at the end of that research, they quite clearly state, accent is not the same as intelligibility.
Mm.
And then I think they were drawn back into this native speaker measurement of one and the other thing. And they said you can have a very strong accent and still be perfectly intelligible, which is a phrase you'd have to actually take apart. Because a strong accent, the word strong is a judgment on the accent. And those judgments were inevitably made by native speakers.
Indeed, yeah, yeah.
But what was critical to me was this thing that they separated out and said accent is not the same as intelligibility. And I think we've always assumed that if you had a good accent, you'd be intelligible. It's automatic. But that was always drawn to the idea that the good accent would be something close to a native speaker accent. It's a sort of default setting that's incredibly hard to get rid of when you work on pronunciation.
Mm.
Now, the problem is, as I've found out the longer I've lived outside an English-speaking country, that native speaker accents are not automatically intelligible, and yet we would automatically think they were good. They're native speaker accents. What more could you want? But there's many a Friday evening where we switch to the Spanish language version of an American film, for example, because it's stressful. It's too tiring for us to actually follow the and my wife is totally bilingual, but the two of us look at each other sometimes and say, nah, let's just put the Spanish on.
The Spanish audio of an American film.
The other thing we regularly do for the same reason when we're with films from the UK or from the US, we regularly put subtitles on.
Okay. I remember putting the subtitles on when I watched The Angels Share with the Scottish accent. I had to.
Wow.
Actually, the subtitles in English weren't available. I watched them in German, but we were listening to the English audio.
That's a weird experience, actually, watching another language that you speak and they're speaking your first language.
Yeah. I guess an important point there is that intelligibility is also context specific. So
yes,
it depends on who's speaking, different things like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. You
Okay.
can be intelligible to one person, then you move and start speaking to someone else, and they don't
Mm-hmm.
find you as intelligible. But that
Mm.
happens, curiously enough, that happens amongst native speakers, and they think it's normal, and they repair any damage done and move on.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
one of the two people is a non-native speaker of English, then all the blame goes on that person.
Hmm. I see that in my students. My students, I have to regularly remind my students that repair strategies are quite normal for L1 communication, but my students are quick to blame themselves if they can't think of a word.
Yeah, yeah. That
Mm,
happens all the time.
yeah.
But how many? It's
Okay.
also interesting how many times are repair strategies openly taught in classrooms. This was the sort of thing that we took a lot of time over in the 80s when we were learning about communicative language teaching. And you came out of your MA or whatever you'd done, and full of the idea of, oh yeah, we've got it, and nothing happened, and nothing appeared in course books that explicitly told
Mm,
people failure to communicate is a pretty constant, a constant of all human communication, and it's really
mm,
important to be able to recognize it, not feel ashamed about that you failed to communicate, and get on with the business of repairing the communication. But it doesn't appear in course
mm,
books, and it's disappeared off most
mhm,
people's maps.
mm. Just thinking aloud here, I wonder if that's because it sort of requires a bit of reflection about how L1 language use works, and that would maybe require a teacher to have knowledge of the student's L1 to say, look, you'd say these things in your language as well. That's completely normal.
Yeah, well, I think
So,
that native speakers of English who are teaching English really do need to have a good command, or to try at least to get a good command of the language of their
mm,
students. I mean, that's part of the students' inbuilt sort of mechanism. So let's get to know how it works, and then we can build bridges between the two languages. You work in a similar
mm,
situation to me. Your students all share the same first language, or mostly they share the same first language. And it's just an incredible shame that more use is not made of that first language. And I think
mm,
it's a failing on behalf of teachers who are in the sort of situations we're in, if they don't make serious efforts to learn the language of the country that they're working. It doesn't matter if those efforts fail, which they won't, but it doesn't matter if you don't become fully fluent in your student's first language. But you really should make an effort as a professional to be able to get to at least an upper intermediate C1 level of that language and understand how it works, and then bring it into the classroom, including the
mm.
pronunciation
Yeah.
classroom.
And isn't that then also empowering for non-native teachers who speak the first language that of their students, and to know exactly what sorts of things are going to influence the target language in what
There's
ways?
a huge lot more empathy, I think, between
Mm,
teacher and students if they're both in the if they're in parallel journeys. So I'm in the journey of learning
yeah,
Spanish, and you're in the journey of learning English, and my God, I struggle with this. I mean, telling my students
yeah.
words that I, even today, after 45 years in Spain, there are words that I avoid in a conversation because I know I'm going to struggle to get them out of my mouth. That sort of thing is so powerful in the classroom. And then students would actually bring in, and we put on the board lists of words that we hate and we try not to use in English, things like that.
Okay, I've got a question for you now about, well, it's related to your career, but I understand that, am I right in saying that you probably predominantly see yourself as a teacher more than an industry expert? Would you
Well,
agree?
I don't see myself as an expert. I hate the word. It's so intimidating.
Okay,
I suppose I have a
right,
certain
right.
expertise.
Okay.
Um, I
Well,
try never
you are
to
known
lose,
as.
sorry, I try never to lose sight of the fact that I'm a teacher.
Mhm. Well, I mean, that's the right attitude, right? If we see ourselves as constantly learning, then we're never going to hit that ceiling of being an expert, perhaps. But anyway, so you are known as a writer. Well, this is definitely how I became aware of you, and I imagine other teachers interested in pronunciation as a writer. focusing on pronunciation in lingua franca contexts and with a heavy pronunciation focus. So most of what you've done, your affiliation with PronSIG and Speak Out, the PronSIG journal as well. But how would your students describe you? I ask this question because I think that in the industry we're known as pronunciation people, but I don't see that as the main part of my teaching. That's a big part of it, obviously. But yeah, how would your students describe you as a teacher and your focus on pronunciation or other things?
Well, my work in the sort of everyday classroom took part in a school of tourism. And we had 3 or 4 hours a week of classes. And obviously, a very small part of that was pronunciation work because the syllabus just didn't give me time for more than that. So I've always taught pronunciation within a framework of teaching English. In this case, it's a branch of business English, isn't it? The business is tourism. And it's interesting because it was precisely the lack of time that drove me to look for priorities, and that led me through to English as a lingua franca. But how did my students see me? I think in general, they were happy to see me worried about pronunciation. And many admitted that they'd had no guidance in secondary school. That's partly because of when English became the dominant language, the dominant foreign language in Spanish educational systems, because during the dictatorship and in the first years after the dictatorship until more or less the early 80s, the dominant second language was French. And then the early 80s switched through to English. So I'm sure students reaching university today would have had help with pronunciation. I'm not sure how much, but my students were very, very grateful for the little bits of work that we did, because it was the first time that someone had given them structured, developed help on their pronunciation. And they knew that it was important. They knew intuitively, or they knew because they'd been out and found people didn't understand.
In Germany, when I do pronunciation focused activities, they're warm to it often, but it's not a thirst. I remember I had a group for a week of Spanish people that had come to Berlin just for a week of English, and they were desperate. They were like, teacher, help us. And I imagine that's similar to the context or the situations that you've had.
I think the status of English in Germany has been, it's a different road to the road I've just described about English arriving late into Spanish education systems, but also the similarities in pronunciation between German and English are far greater. So they have fewer pronunciation problems. I had a project, a European project over 4 years with a school of tourism in Holland, and they didn't do any pronunciation work. There was virtually nothing in English that they couldn't pronounce intelligibly. And okay, there were some things that were slightly different, but purely at a level of accent. So there was a tendency for had to sound more like head. But then you see that would be New Zealand anyway. So that was a sort of slight accent difference that never really caused any issues. So in a place like Holland, I witnessed from my colleagues that there was very little work done, and I would imagine the same is true in Germany for the same reason. It's just not so critical. Whereas when I've worked in places like Italy, there's a huge thirst for work with teachers to show them how to teach pronunciation. And I imagine if you were to work in Japan, you'd get the same sort of thing, that they would want a lot of help.
Okay. This was a question for a little bit later, but I might throw it in now. I've been looking at the literature for reading a lot lately, and every now and then you see something in the literature which says if students are coming from an alphabetic language that uses the Latin alphabet, then phonics teaching, for example, won't be important. And Spanish and Italian are two languages which have very shallow orthography, as it's called. So there's high correspondence between the letters and the pronunciation of them. I'm very interested in German, in Germany, and in English. People are more flexible with pronunciations that deviate from their intuition of how it should be pronounced based on the spelling. And so I'm interested to know, in Spain, how much of a struggle is that in your experience teaching in a country with such high correspondence between spelling and sound in Spanish in their first language?
No, it's a struggle. It's a struggle because, well, if you leave them alone, they're going to use their mother tongue correspondences, and that will often produce something that's got very limited intelligibility. Very limited.
Mm.
And it's a struggle because once you start unpacking the correspondences that are there in English, they often just lose motivation. They just throw their hands up in horror and they say, this is ridiculously hard. Why on earth have you done this? And then they're panicking, every time they see a word. If they see two vowels together, like an E followed by an A, they're going, what the hell do we do with this? So it's actually quite a big put off for them. And you have to help them to overcome it. And initially, it's embarrassing to look back, but you just say, well, it's like that. And you just have to get used to it. Well, that's not an answer, that's not helping them. It's like that, and you have to get used to it. And it's a poor answer because although it is quite opaque, the sound spelling issue with English, it isn't totally chaotic. There are many correspondences that are true and they're worth knowing. And often if you have a rule and you come across something that doesn't obey the rule, that thing that doesn't obey the rule sticks in your mind anyway. So it's been learned because it obey the rule. So it is a struggle for different reasons, for the motivational reasons for the students, and because of left alone, what they pronounce will be unintelligible or very poorly intelligible, requiring massive efforts on behalf of the listener, who will get tired and stop listening. So, yeah. But that doesn't mean it's a struggle, and therefore you have to deal with it. And it wasn't dealt with. That's a problem.
Just kind of ignored, yeah.
It has all sorts of, and you see, if you could ignore it and it just didn't matter too much, it's just one of those complications, fine. But as you said earlier on, poor pronunciation, especially at lower levels, affects everything else. So by not dealing with pronunciation in a place like Spain or Italy or Japan early on in the business, then you're actually threatening their chances of improving with listening, their chances of reading just goes way out the window. Reading is a nightmare for them if they have poor pronunciation.
You've been somebody who's personally contributed to my understanding of the connection between reading and pronunciation. You've also talked about Catherine Walter's articles that she's published in Speak Out. I believe you were the editor at that time. There seems to be a lot more work that can be done. I'm teaching some teachers at the moment, and they've asked me for some phonics resources to learn about the sound spelling correspondences. And it almost seems like, one, it would need to be language specific. So there would need to be resources for the German market or for the Spanish market in your case. But two, then that would mean that we'd have to choose an accent as well. And it's this big kind of question mark. But I think that a lot of earlier career teachers or secondary teachers don't really have many resources they can turn to learn about these correspondences.
That would be my assessment as well. I'm not against phonics. I'm not anti-phonics, but I'm not sure that phonics has understood things like accent. And we were at a local event here in Spain, and one of the gurus of phonics had come, and the primary school teachers were being shown how phonics was absolutely critical and that it should be introduced in Spanish primary schools now. This was the sort of stuff, and this was this guru who had landed in from the UK, And I'm sat behind two local teachers, both Spanish L1 speakers. And the person leading the event had a Northern English accent, and they spotted that two sounds that they understood were different vowels were being said with exactly the same pronunciation by this person. And I thought, wow, that's very interesting. They've seen how it's a bit more complicated than it's made out to be. And then in another event in Madrid, I actually asked, again, the person leading the event, what they would do about people's accents as they try to be models for their students in a phonics approach. Basically didn't get an answer from this person. So I have a sort of uneasiness with phonics in that respect, in that it doesn't seem to have got away from a prestige native speaker pronunciation of the different sounds that correspond to the different spellings. At the same time, I thought, my God, everything I've been to in Spain connected to phonics has been about primary school teaching. I could use this phonics stuff with adults. It would be brilliant for adults. It would be so beneficial for them because it would give them that sort of basic, that foundation understanding of sound, spelling, correspondences, from which, as I said earlier, sometimes they'll spot something which doesn't fit the rule, and that would probably be a learning process.
Yeah. Well, I guess you're working with the phonemic chart, the phonetic symbols, is a version of that. If you discuss the different spellings that can realize the or vowel or the vowel, for example.
Yeah, but making clear that, as I say, it's embarrassing to look back and think I just said to my students, well, I'm sorry, it's a bit crazy and all that. You just have to get used to it. That is not the answer. Absolutely not. There are a lot of correspondences, and students do benefit from them being shown. And, I've worked on in private classes with people from the science departments because my degree's in chemistry, and they were glad to have an English speaker who wasn't scared by science. And they look, they're scientists. And I say to them, look, if you get EA, then you've got basically three options. It can be this, it can be that, or it can be the other. And they go, wow, that's really powerful. And then they come back a fortnight later and say, this one doesn't work. And I go, fine, that's what.
Yeah. All right. Robin, I've got a little section for the next part of the podcast that I'm going to call What's Going On Here? And I'm going to tell you a little anecdote, and I would then ask you the question at the end, what's going on here?
Right.
So I've been speaking, or two things relating to French speakers, actually. So a friend of mine is from France, and she's coming to Germany. She's realized, okay, English is quite an important part of life in Germany. And we were talking about intelligibility the other day. And she said, I played her a clip of a French speaker who's a cognitive scientist, Stanislas Dehaene, and he's presenting on how reading works. And he has a highly intelligible accent, but there are some realizations of some consonants, for example, the R, which sounded quite French. And she said to me, I thought, but he's French. He's clearly French. I said, so what? I can understand everything he's saying. And she said, but I thought the goal was to remove any traces of my French accent. So I'm identifying a perception different. I'm going to follow that up with something very, very similar. There's a perception difference here between what the goal of pronunciation teaching is and what is intelligible, I believe. And, that's something that I know you have thoughts about. And there's this Macron meme that went around as well. He said at the Davos conference, he said, for sure. And this was turned into this meme, and it made it into Le Monde.fr as well. And they talked about how they were making fun of his accent. And I'm thinking, hang on a second, Macron is 100% intelligible. Why is there this attitude towards accent, even from other native speakers of that country? So what do you think? What's going on here?
Because there is a default setting, as I said earlier in the podcast, and it's in the minds of everybody that when you're learning another language, you want to speak it like the native speakers. This is the default setting of learning another language. And the problem is that people haven't grasped that English isn't just another language. It happens to be the world's lingua franca, right? And so different, you're aiming, the goal is different. The goal is no longer to sound like a native speaker. The goal is to be intelligible. And it's quite difficult to actually move that, because it begins with people understanding that whether they like it or not, English is not just another language that people are learning. It's separate from other languages. I saw this with a colleague in Britain, that he was saying, if I learn German, I want to speak German like the Germans. And we had to point out, yeah, but if you're learning German, you're learning it presumably to join the community of German speakers, to go and work in Germany or to have constant contact. But German doesn't have the role that English has. It is not a lingua franca. So in all of those situations, the same happened with the woman that was the mayor of Madrid at the time. And it was when Madrid was bidding for the Olympic Games, and she got up to speak in English. And it was all over the place. Everyone was laughing at her. Her English was appalling. And she actually mixed in a couple of phrases in Spanish in her prepared talk. And I've taken that prepared talk and asked people to write down what she said. And so they listen and they write down what she said, which is a basic test of intelligibility. And everybody writes down almost without fault what she said. And I say to them, okay, she's got an accent and it's obvious she's right at her limit as she speaks here. But she has been totally intelligible, as you now know. You've just written down word for word what she said. And therefore, sorry guys, but you're going to have to get over your prejudices about accent. And this is what they are. They are prejudices.
That's such an interesting topic. I feel like this is absolutely, we could talk for days about this almost. In Germany, there's transfer of the understanding, they call it Hochdeutsch or High German, and then they want to speak High English and look for equivalencies there. And I say, well, no, historically, it's a global language, the influence of the United States and colonialism, this all comes into it. But I guess it's, if you make an assumption about something lacking further information, it's almost a natural thing to do. I guess I'm speaking aloud, identifying a problem with this, or an extra challenge for us teachers to manage those expectations for students. Yeah.
I think like this default setting, if I must get to this prestige accent of the native speakers, I feel it's more prevalent in the north of Europe. I got the same in Poland. I've been there a lot working, and I got the same in Russia. And in fact, when I was recording samples of non-native speaker English for the handbook on teaching ELF pronunciation, when I was doing the recordings, in one of the studio days, everyone had done their bit and we'd all had our conversations and so on and so forth. And the German girl came up to me and said, "I'm sorry, I'd like to withdraw my permission." And I said, "Yeah, of course, you're entirely free. I mean, absolutely, no problem. I'll ditch your recording." She said, "I just hate my accent." Now, what had been going on in my head as I listened to her in the studio was, my God, I can't really use this. Her English is so absolutely super good that it's intimidating. And it was really strange that I was thinking it's not useful to me because it was too perfect, and she wanted to withdraw because she thought she had an appalling accent. This is so damaging, Putting these monolithic goals. This is the only correct English pronunciation. It's so damaging.
Yeah.
And
It's a big question mark for us. Yeah.
And then in the end, if it then isn't actually intelligible. And I remember some work done in Japan out of the British Council in Tokyo by a researcher who presented in Harrogate at IATEFL quite a few years back. And she picked up on translators, Japanese translators who'd been at the Davos conference, and then they had all the recordings and they had to go and translate them into Spanish. And they suffered desperately with one particular speaker in terms of getting what the person said off the recording and onto the written page. And that speaker was David Cameron.
Yeah.
But he's the most RP of all of the people at that conference. Well, he wasn't the most intelligible.
Super interesting. Okay, I'm going to come now to, we spoke about the lingua franca core at the start of it. I'd like to know, how has it specifically helped your students, you having this knowledge? And in what way were you able to adapt your teaching based on identifying the lingua franca core priorities?
Well, you'll have to ask my students if it helped them. It helped me because my search, as I said, was I have very limited time. What can I concentrate on? And so my first attempt to do this produced a talk at IATEFL in Vienna many, many years ago, and then my first published article, which was in Speak Out, Phonetics in the Communicative Classroom. And in that article, I remember saying, you know, if the ed ending on the past tense of a regular verb has 3 pronunciations and it also marks pastness, then we need to concentrate on that. And that's what I did in my classes. It became a priority. And then if native speakers are using weak forms all the time, well, we need to concentrate on that. And I started getting my students doing weak forms. When the lingua franca core came along, it blew all of this out of the water. There was no data to suggest that dropping final consonants, even though they were the past tense marker, there was no data to suggest that this acted on intelligibility. And there was data to suggest that weak forms impact negatively on intelligibility. So I stopped worrying about whether my students were pronouncing a t or a d or an id, and was a lot more tolerant when they were in communication activities, was a lot more tolerant of that. And I stopped teaching weak forms and quite a lot of the stuff to do with connected speech, which is so characteristic of native speaker connected speech at high speed, but is detrimental to intelligibility between non-native speakers who are never going to get to the speeds at which those connected speech modifications come in when native speakers are with each other. So lingua franca core actually seriously impacted on what I was focusing on in classrooms. And then training teachers around Spain or in places like Poland or Italy, when I showed them the core and we took a list of the typical things Italians do when they speak English, and then we filtered them out saying, is that typical problem actually in the lingua franca core? Yes, it is. Okay, we need to deal with it. No, it's not. We can push it aside. They go, oh, wow, that's really great because it's so hard to do and get right. I mean, I didn't meet many teachers who were unhappy at the idea of not having to teach weak forms.
Absolutely.
So it's a lighter workload, which allows you to focus on what really matters.
Yeah. Have there been any other people or other works that have been also significantly impactful on your teaching and your understanding over your career? I mean, obviously a lot, but anybody that comes to mind?
Peter Roach.
Yeah.
Yeah, because, you know, you
In what
come
way?
into English language teaching because you move to a country where there's nothing else you're going to be able to do. And for the first couple of years, I just sort of survived. And then you think, well, you know, this is actually going to be my life, so I better start learning about this business. And then you bump up against pronunciation, which up until then, you see, students had said, how do you pronounce this word? And you'd said, well, like this. And then they'd say, but I mean, are you making a fricative there? And I go, what the hell is a fricative? So there's this point where you think, I need to know about pronunciation. I mean, I assume mine's okay. I have to assume that I'm a native speaker, but I don't understand what's happening. And the book that really, really made it all accessible to me was Peter Roach's book with Cambridge University Press. And I think I bought the second, and I then went on and was given the fourth edition. I have a wonderful photograph of me and Peter Roach, one of the IATEFLs, I think Harrogate, and I have his fourth edition in my hand. And it was so accessible, this book, because I'd gone to others. Gimson was the one that they used at the university here in phonetics courses, and that was just dreadful. I mean, it really was a nightmare to get through. I mean, I go back again and again to it now. Yeah, but I understand pronunciation now and phonetics now. The book that really stood me on my feet and said, it's okay, you do know, you understand, was Peter Roach's book.
And isn't it, it's easy for people who have a keen interest in pronunciation to perhaps go and buy a book of Peter Roach and work through that course to learn about it. But for teachers that maybe don't have the time or not as interested, it's fantastic now that we have your book and Gemma's book on the market to really know how, the issues of the lingua franca core or the features can influence classroom practice. So that's excellent.
We had a great time actually doing this latest book with AUP, the one on English as a global language pronunciation. Yeah, it was good because we've both worked in similar situations in terms of working with teachers who are interested in pronunciation. But we both understood that most teachers are so busy that they need something that they can get started on, that they can believe in it, and understand the notion of international intelligibility, and then walk into the classroom with it, an activity that's coherent with international intelligibility, and do the activity, and it'll work for them. And then afterwards, think about it. And I think that is something that OUP built into that series, which I really like, that the theory doesn't come first. It's a little tack on at the end. If you're interested, this activity works for this reason. Yeah, that was a lot of fun switching it around. We've always worked, academics always work from theory and then suggest possible practical applications, which is what happened. I mean, Jenny's book was like that. She wasn't telling teachers what to do, but that's also why when I said, we need something that's more of a handbook for teachers, she and Barbara Seidelhofer just said immediately, well, you better start writing it.
Excellent. Yeah.
That was.
You mentioned in the book and also in the Oxford University Press position paper on pronunciation, the role of the phonological loop.
Yeah.
In terms of retention of vocabulary, listening, and also reading. This is something that I'm super, super fascinated in personally. Could you talk about that? How does the phonological loop, what's the connection between that and
I didn't
reading?
understand any of this, and I was listening to Michael Swan and Catherine Walter in 2008 at IATEFL in Exeter. And they were doing something based on the work that Catherine Walter was doing in her research about reading in English as an L. Michael debunked one or two myths at the beginning about what happens when we're reading, and then Catherine came up and described her research. So it was very much a session about reading. And then right at the very, very end, she said, as a final remark, if you actually really, really seriously want your students to get better at reading, teach them pronunciation. And I couldn't believe what she was saying, and I'd just taken over as editor of Speak Out. And I ran down. I'd met her once or twice before briefly, and I said, okay, you won't remember me, but I'm now editing Speak Out. What you just said warrants an article. And I would love it if you'd write that article. You've got 3,000 words. And of course, as with all extremely busy people, she wrote the article. It needed no editing. And it was in on time. And it was incredible for me. because I had tied pronunciation into everything else. It's obvious with speaking, it's obvious with listening. I'd even found writing mistakes that were clearly due to my students' perceptions of the word through their poor pronunciation. And he was reading in it, and finally, all of the four skills are tied in. And it was Catherine's article that led me to understand that when we hear something, we have to send it around this thing in our short-term memory called the phonological loop. And it's sort of like, in comes the data, but the data's not storable in that form. And it needs to go around the phonological loop, which means that it's actually sort of said internally inside your head in order to come back to the short-term memory and be sent off for long-term keeping. And when you don't know the pronunciation of a word, apparently in its attempt to get around the phonological loop, the actual signal decays, sometimes massively. Nothing gets back to be directed off for long-term memory. And that suddenly go, oh my God, I can see this. And I saw myself in the classroom, and I saw myself with students who were reading in the classroom. And you could see that this student is struggling to read because their finger has now gone onto the page. We're talking about 20-year-olds. It's not a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old home with mother or father. This is a 20-year-old at university, and their finger is on the page touching the words. And I'd say to those students, are you struggling with reading in English? Oh, it's so hard. And I go, okay, I have these books you can take home and do some leisure reading. And I'd send my students home to do more reading. And of course, that wasn't helping. What they need was help with this thing we talked about earlier, being able to put sounds to the words in order to get what they read turned into a sound signal that would go around the phonological loop and then get sent off to long-term memory. And that was also a huge change. Then I go, oh my God, I can't abandon them, especially in the early stages when there is so many difficulties for them, turning what is seen on the page into something that will successfully go around the phonological.
Have you also then used reading aloud in your classrooms?
Not a lot, because reading aloud is an extremely complex skill. So like to get a student to read 3 or 4 lines and then you pass the text on to other students. People who can read aloud successfully paid huge sums of money and tell us the news on television, for example.
Yeah,
a really complex thing to read. To read aloud in another language, that's really bad.
Can I just come in there? In the literature, there are people that are against it, saying, it's not a standard skill that's used in adult lives, which I disagree with, actually, because parents of children read aloud regularly. And then there are others that say, just don't make students read something aloud they've never seen before. Give them time to understand it first.
Yeah, well, that's definitely where I would be. And so sometimes I'd construct activities where my students had to go away and record a radio program. They wrote the script to the program, and then they took their time and recorded it. And then that's useful reading aloud, because as they're reading, before they read aloud to record, they told me, they made jolly sure that they could pronounce the word. Now, by making sure, they're making that marriage between spelling and sound. Where they weren't sure of the correspondences, they'd come and get help from me. Or they'd go to an online dictionary and get help. Or they'd ask friends and get help. But the text is theirs, and then they're preparing the pronunciation, and then they go and decide to do the final recording. And those recordings were made available for other students to listen to. So I think that's a really useful reading aloud experience for them. So, I mean, people said they should never read aloud. I'm sorry, the minute we start saying never, you probably haven't looked hard enough at the issue.
I mean, there are any number of classroom techniques that can be performed poorly in the wrong hands. Teacher talking time, dictation, even pair work and group work. Everything can be done poorly.
poetry is a lovely thing if students are interested, if your situation allows you to take poetry. And I used to take poetry or songs, I would take them in when I was working with teachers on in-service training, because they'd all come from an English language background at university and they had a feel for literature. So I'd take some poetry in and I'd say, the thing about poetry, and all of the really top people in poetry all said it has to be said. It hasn't to be read in silence. It has to be vocalized. It was vocalized as they wrote it, and they chose the words they chose because they came well out of the mouth, and they sound good once they're out of the mouth. So poetry has to be read. So let's read some poems to each other. It's reading aloud, but it's really great for pronunciation teaching.
Well, I wonder how else you went about supporting your students with reading, as you discovered that pronunciation was a critical part, as highlighted by Catherine Walter at the end of that talk, that they might need help with pronunciation. What else you did to support them in that way, or just general pronunciation teaching you? It increased the priority of it for you.
I don't think, I don't. Well, it came too late in my career.
Okay.
For it to have a major impact. But I think what it made me see, and this was a sort of correlation, and it was just me thinking, if it's impacting their reading, then they need to know the pronunciation of those words before they read. Otherwise, they can't successfully and with reasonable ease, they can't read. So I spent a lot more time checking out reading texts for possible pronunciation problems before I released my students to read. So somehow, you know you're going to be doing this reading text tomorrow in class, or 2 days from now in class. Well, perhaps go in the day before and work on the words that you know will be problematic for them when it comes to them reading, so that when they actually get finally to the reading texts, the pronunciation of those words is familiar to them.
It kind of goes against the advice as well that students should be trained to guess from context and then identify cognates and things like that, because if they see a cognate, then they'd be likely to use their L1 phonology. You gave the example in the OUP position paper on pronunciation of real, the word real in the Spanish accent, real.
Yeah.
And that they might be triggering that phonology every time they see that word on a page.
Yeah.
Thereby reinforcing it.
Yeah.
And I see that as a real issue, that we might be inadvertently helping students reinforce their L1 phonology.
Which is why it seems to me important that the minute a word appears, that we should deal with its pronunciation. Any new word needs the pronunciation dealt with. And going back to the actual, they should learn to read and survive without knowing the meaning of all the words. Yeah, native speakers, you take away 10% of the words in a text and they're struggling to put the text back together. That's a simple close exercise. You take away 20% of the words in a text, and most native speakers cannot put the text back together. They can't fill in the gaps. And yet we would happily throw our students at a text in English where they know only 70% of the words, and the words they don't know are the actual content words. And we tell them, survive. Slightly ill at ease with this thing, and throw them in, give them the text, don't give them any help, and tell them to survive. Nah.
Yeah.
I think we should put them in the same position that a native speaker would be in as the native speaker approaches a piece of reading. And native speakers, as they approach reading, are familiar with around about 98% of the words on the page.
Okay, so for you, pre-teaching the vocabulary and the pronunciation is critical.
I'm not saying literally on the same day, literally minutes before they read the text, and I'm very much more in favor of bringing those words up deliberately in the days prior to the text, or at least bringing up the absolutely critical words.
Yeah. Transport, was it tourism infrastructure?
Yeah, they hated that word. My God. They did so many things not to use that word in this third year. So
Yeah. Hmm. Okay, Robin, this is the 40th anniversary, the PronSIG 40th anniversary podcast.
Yeah.
So I'd like
Wow.
to hear your thoughts about just your sort of reflections perhaps on your time as the editor of Speak Out, or any sort of standout fond memories that come to mind with your time with PronSIG.
The PronSIG was absolutely fundamental in my professional life. It was a little bit of an accident that I should have joined. Perhaps it was the scientist in me when I did my postgrad training to become a professional teacher. I quickly got interested in the pronunciation, perhaps because of, as I say, my science background. It seemed to fit in there. And then I joined IATEFL, and you get a free SIG. And I looked at the SIGs and I thought, wait, you seem to be enjoying pronunciation, join the PronSIG. And then I turned up with this first article, Phonetics in the Communicative Classroom, and decided I would go to a PronSIG symposium, which we used to have, and it was in Vienna. And at that symposium, I was hooked. I mean, I just loved the environment. I loved being amongst those people. And they were so welcoming and so supportive, because I was really scared. I mean, a chemistry degree, and I'm now teaching people pronunciation. But no. They were very supportive, very friendly, very welcoming. And then suddenly I'm meeting a whole bunch of people who, like you meet Peter Roach for the first time, and his book is the one that's clarified things for you. And there's the person who's having a copy with you. PronSIG was absolutely fundamental. Being the editor was a total privilege. Being in touch with people. And I was blown away when it came to issue number 50, and we decided that, let's try and do something special. It's issue number 50. And I thought, go on, just write to everybody who is sort of like a big name in pronunciation teaching, and see if you can persuade them. And if you write to 10 or 12 and 5 or 6 say yes, then we'll fill in the gaps. Absolutely everybody said yes. And some people said, we're really, really, really pushed for time. I think, again, coming back to them, Tracy and Murray said, oh God, this is like the worst possible time, but we would not want to not contribute. Can we pull together some things and give them a slightly new perspective? But it's not new work, it's not new research. And I said, no, pull some things together. This is the 50th issue. We can look back, well, let's look forward. It was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful.
What a great milestone to have been a part of and involved in the creation of. Amazing.
Yeah, and of course, what it does when you edit, it really gets you thinking. Because this stuff is coming in, and you have to edit it and get it ready for the page and everything like that, and it sets you off. So it was a massive learning process, but above all, it was a huge privilege.
Fantastic. It was. I checked the dates beforehand. I think I might have forgotten now. How many years could you say when you were the editor for us?
Oh my God, I don't know. I remember picking up in 2008. That's when Michael handed over. I don't.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I've got 2 more questions for you, Robin. I'm interested to know your thoughts on what we are doing as language teachers teaching adults, having gone through the secondary education system.
Well, I don't know about
with our students. With our students having gone through the secondary education system. So to what extent, for example, is school setting the expectations to students about what language learning really involves?
I don't know about other countries. I think secondary education is... I spent a lot of time in the School of Tourism trying to repair some damage done to language learners' self-esteems. To get students come in and say to you, I'm not good at languages. I remember a student in 3rd year coming, and I didn't recognize the student. And I said, sorry, are you one of my students? And she said, I would have been in 2nd year, but I didn't bother going to classes because I hadn't passed 1st year. And I said, and what's the issue now? She said, I have a contract. It's not fully signed. I have to get out of here with my diploma. And I don't have first year English, and I don't have second year English, and I don't have third year English. And I'm useless at languages. And so, the minute you hear this, you go, this is a lot of damage that's been done. And I said, you speak Spanish? And she said, yeah. And I said, who taught you? And she said, my parents. And I said, no, they didn't. You're like any baby. You learned your language yourself. You decoded the whole thing yourself. Your parents only complicated the issue by trying to tell you things that you didn't need to know at the wrong time. I said, you're a language learning machine, and someone has switched you off with respect to English, but you do have it in there. And this went on to a series of tutorials and so on and so forth, and she successfully got through the exams and got the job. But it really woke me up. I go, whoa. So much damage can be done if we get hold of a language the wrong way in primary and secondary education. And here in Spain, in primary, my feeling is that they're doing a better and better and better job. I'm working with primary school teachers. It wasn't so difficult for me to convince them that intelligibility is the order of the day. But I didn't find the same responsiveness among secondary school teachers, who seemed to be more hooked on a rule-based approach. But then you could trace that back to the actual syllabuses that had been cooked up by pronunciation experts back in the 80s when Spain switched through to English. And you go, oh my God, it's all about the system and the norm. It's all so norm-driven and about knowledge of the norms, instead of being driven about communicative competences. So that might, and also in Italy, definitely, they said that was the case. In Poland, they're just like, they want it like the book says. Polish mentality, I found that they want, it's a rule, it has to be obeyed, even though it's not helping communication. The rule says. So I think there will be places where secondary education is about communicative competence and students are being helped. But at least in Spain, when they come to university or when they're adults, there are scars and there are low self-esteem, and they need dealing with.
It touches on a personal note for me, because my mother, she's in her 70s now. She was told when she was in school that she was bad at German. She'd never be able to pronounce German sounds.
Right.
And so she believed her entire life that she was a poor language learner. And I just showed her a couple of a few aspects of German pronunciation. She's like, oh, I can do it now. And so literally her entire life, she was walking around. Every time language came up in social conversation, she'd go, oh, no, I'm terrible at languages.
Yeah. Well, we got the same. We did 9 O-levels back then, 9 or 10 O-levels. My worst grade was French. And so I just assumed, I'm not a language learner. And then I came here to Spain and discovered another me. I can't go out there and they think I'm a native speaker. Some people do, but most people quickly twig there's bits left in my accent. But I'm a communicator in Spanish. I have no problems. And my wife always said, my God, you were so quick in becoming totally fluent in Spanish and able to deal with life. And I thought, and I came here thinking, I'm not a language learner. So it's a difficult. I was a secondary school teacher before I came to Spain. Adolescence is a difficult time. Sometimes perhaps it is necessary to have a standard class with simple rule-based teaching. I teach you a rule and tomorrow I test you, because students' minds are elsewhere when they're going through adolescence. Especially, I would say, with 14, 15-year-olds. It's such a difficult time.
Yeah, I think it's important to say it's not criticism of secondary school, but there are so many extra challenges that secondary school teachers face motivation, as you mentioned.
And there are many
they're in
challenges today
classes
that we didn't face because of social networking and things like that. So I would not go back voluntarily into secondary school education. No.
Yeah. I was attended a talk by a secondary professor or teaching training teachers, and she said that, remember, students are in school for 30 hours a week. They have to go where they're told to go, wear what they're told to wear if they have a uniform, be where they have to be, and learn what they have to learn, what somebody else has decided they have to learn. And, any adult or anybody in that position, would also struggle in that context.
I think probably a lot of English language teaching syllabuses around the world could do with a total and utter revamp, focused on getting these students communicatively competent in English.
Yeah.
What
I had a training teacher
if they don't put an S on the third person?
Yeah.
So let's just dump that. And if they pick it up, they'll pick it up. And if they don't, it doesn't matter. And the same, obviously, this is where the lingua franca core comes in. Let's focus the pronunciation work on things that really will give them competence as they speak in English. And from that competence, confidence to speak English and be users of English.
I have this idea that people come out of school believing that language exists as something on the page, but it's really something up here in our heads. I had a trainee teacher come to me asking for advice for what she can do with her students, a sort of wavering motivation. And a question I asked her was, what's in the exam? What are they tested on? And she said, there's a reading comprehension, and then they have to, I think, write in the pronouns or something like that. And I said, is there any listening? Is there any speaking?
Yeah.
And she said, no, my supervisor said there's no time for that. And that was at a vocational school in Germany, So, I guess we have people as well setting the parameters of testing and things like that who are managing all different subjects. And it's another subject, like geography or whatever that can be tested on the paper. But anyway, that's another issue. Final question for you.
Okay.
And this is about the future and AI. I would like to know what you think AI won't be able to do, or why teachers in general are going to remain critical, or maybe you don't see it.
Empathy. There's no empathy you see in AI. They can't relax into a little spontaneous joke or natural laugh. It's such a threatening thing, pronunciation. It's interesting that we don't feel threatened by a text on a page. We stick at it, and sometimes we think, well, I haven't fully understood that, but you don't feel that you're rubbish. When the pronunciation doesn't come out of your mouth, or you don't understand people, or they don't understand you, that really goes in deep. And so to have a real person there. In Spain, you're allowed, I don't know if it's still true, but sometimes I just with my hand just catch the elbow of a student and look at them in the face and say, it's okay, it's fine. It was okay. You don't get that from artificial intelligence. The human touch. And something as delicate as pronunciation teaching, which is riven with places where you can fail massively, then that human touch, I think, is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Empathy and the human touch. Brilliant. Okay, Robin, we're going to finish up there, I think, unless you have any final thoughts that you would like to add before we hit stop on the recording.
No, it's been really nice to be able to think about these things again. Yeah, thank you very much for the questions and everything.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for your time. Okay, bye.
Bye then, Mike.